Thank you very much for the introduction. But before I come to the topic, what can you offer me as a Muslim pastor? Just a short presentation. As it was said, I have been a pastor in Gellerup Church, and this is Gellerup Church that we see here, for 26 years. And then after that, I was a bishop 2005 to 2017 in the Diocese of Lolland-Falster, the southern part of Denmark. And after that, I wrote my PhD thesis, which was completed in 2022. But it was in 1991 to 93, while I was a pastor in Gellerup, that the parish changed dramatically. In these 2 years, many Muslims, mostly Palestinians, settled and took up residence in Gellerup, with the consequence that in this period, the Muslim population doubled and the Danish National Church became a minority church. Not even 50% of the population in the parish were members of the church, and there were now 60 nationalities. From that time, I've been studying Islam and been involved in dialogue with Muslims in many ways. I've published some books on the topic, Islam and Christianity. The first was in 1994. The Foreigner You Will Always Have With You, it's called. And another book was in 2004, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor, which is the title for this lecture. And in 2022, I finished my PhD on Judgment Day in Islam and Christianity. My lecture earlier this afternoon was a theological statement of differences and similarities of Christianity and Islam, and I introduced my PhD on Judgment Day in Islam and Christianity. Now, in this lecture, I'll like to tell you more about my own personal experience with meeting Muslims. I'll give you a few examples from these meetings and dialogues, and then tell you about my answer and my problems in answering the question, what can you offer me as a Muslim pastor? And I hope that this can be useful for you and inspire and encourage you to meet and talk to Muslims and to share life, thoughts, and faith with each other. This is the Turkish Imam and the chairman for my local mosque in Brabrand from a dialogue meeting that we had some years ago about Judgment Day. But the first I want to say is, or quote, it's an Arabic proverb or saying which I myself often have used as a reminder for myself. It says, not all fingers are the same, even though they belong to the same hand. Like all of us, Muslims are not all alike. They come from different countries, they have different language, different work and status. They don't think and believe in the same way. They are, in short, different. So this is the first thing we have to know and to remember. This means, secondly, even though that you might know much about Islam and Muslims, you don't know what the specific Muslim you have in front of you thinks, believes, behaves, or feels. He or she is the only one to tell you. I myself have been surprised many times. It has surprised me that many Muslims don't know the Quran. Many don't go to the mosque. Many don't even pray. But a lot of Muslims are fasting and keep the Ramadan. And as you know, we are now in the middle of the Ramadan right now. Muslims have, in general, the same relations to Ramadan as Christmas, as Christians to Christmas. And in a way, we are celebrating the same event, God's words coming to us. Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God, and Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the word of God sent to the world. We celebrate this with a long preparation time and end with a big celebration. Eid for the Muslims and Christmas for the Christians. On the Faroe Island, they have a proverb or saying that I mentioned earlier this day, "Glecht er gestens eia," and I think it's almost as in Iceland. The eyes of the foreigner are clear. The foreigner sees things that you might not be aware of, and on the other way around, you can see things that he is not aware of. You might have something spiritual and cultural that he misses or needs. This is a beautiful encouragement to meet and listen to each other. But in this meeting, you first of all have to be silent and be listening and humble. Maybe you know the Danish Steen Skovsgaard's word about humility in helping and understanding others. He said, "All true help begins with humiliation. The helper must first humble himself before those he wants to help, and hereby understand that to help is not to rule, but to serve. Help is willingness to be humble, and for a moment to realize that you are wrong and you don't understand what the other understands." I'll give you a few examples. Many years ago, I went to a conference in Copenhagen, and one of the topics were, how do I meet a Muslim? And there was a very competent Norwegian pastor who gave a very good lecture. After the conference, the pastor and I went by taxi to the same hotel, and I took the back seat and he took the front seat next to the driver, who was Arabic looking with black hair, and his Danish was not that good. The pastor started a conversation with the driver, and I was listening to this, what might become a practical lecture. But this didn't go very well because the driver couldn't understand Norwegian. Hvordan er det ikke drosje? The driver didn't know the word drosje. When we came to the hotel, the pastor paid the driver and said, "See you another time, inshallah." The driver shook his head. He said, "Don't you greet me in this way," he said. "I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm not a Muslim." So the Muslim in front of you might be a Christian, and taxi drivers are very often still Christians. By another meeting, I also learned to be more humble. It took place in a bazaar in Turkey. I was looking for t-shirts for my children to bring home some presents, and they were surprisingly cheap, even though it was the most expensive branded products. I asked the first shop assistant, are they real? Nike, Adidas, and whatever the brands were? "Yes, of course," he answered. But I doubted if this was true. And I asked another man, and he said the same. Then I asked a third assistant, and he answered, "No, of course not. It couldn't be so cheap if they were real brands." "Oh, thank you," I said. "I'll buy 4 from you. You see, I'm a Christian, and I don't like when people are lying." And he said to me, "And I don't lie because I'm a Muslim." My very first meeting and religious dialogue with a young Muslim took place in '93 during my sabbatical. He was so kind and invited me to his home in order to tell me more about Islam and how he was practicing his religion. He showed me where and when and how he prayed, told me about Ramadan and the scriptures, and we were sitting on the floor having a cup of tea. During our conversation, I noticed a picture on the wall. It was a man who was weeping with big tears. He looked like Jesus on the way to Golgotha. I asked him, "Who is that person?" He didn't know and I studied the picture and saw that it was John the Baptist. I told him, and he answered, I don't care, but I'm so happy with this picture because it shows my feelings, how I feel inside. I was surprised because he looked so happy, so proud, so integrated, and then he had this wound. I learned an important lesson by this meeting. Not only this young Muslim, but all of us have wounds and are suffering in one or other way. This is it's good to remember in order to understand each other and to be more sympathetic. How and where do we meet? Here it is important that we use our imagination. We have to meet people where they are, and this might not always be where we think they are. The Anglican priest, Christopher Lamb, has told me this little story. One day he was invited to visit an old man who lived in a small house in the countryside. He came at the appointed time and knocked at the door, but no one opened the door. He knocked again, but apparently no one was at home. Then he noticed a spider web on the door and realized that this door was never used. He had to look for another entrance. And quite right. There was an entrance on the other side of the house, and here the man was sitting and waiting for the priest. This little story is a good illustration of how to meet and get in contact with people you don't know, especially if their religion and culture are different from your own. There might be other ways to get in contact than you may think. This was the book, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor, which I wrote many years ago. But this is an illustration for one of the best and most successful initiatives that we started in Gellerup Church, which was and is called International Evenings. Here, immigrants from the area are invited to join a dinner and fellowship in the church, and there is different program during the evening. Sometimes there are more than 15 to 20 different nationalities together, and here there is a very good opportunity to learn and to be together with other cultures and religions. And first of all, you eat together and get to know each other's food and eating habits. This is certainly an initiative that I can recommend. And this is a cookbook with recipes for foreign foods. If you want to get in contact with Muslims, it's always a good idea to ask for help, like Jesus does in John chapter 3, where he meets the Samaritan woman. Tired as he was from the journey, he sat down by the well, and when the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me something to drink?" This was the beginning of a long conversation between Jesus and the woman. So, ask for help, and I'm sure you will be surprised to meet such a great hospitality and readiness to help. And now to the title of this lecture from my book, What Can You Offer Me as a Muslim Pastor? When I was a pastor in Gellerup Church, in 1995, I was appointed by the bishop as a diocese pastor with reference to Islam and Christianity in the Diocese of Aarhus. Even though that I have studied only a little of Islam and wrote my small book called You Always Have the Foreigners Among You, I was very insecure because what does it mean to be a diocese pastor? And what was actually my task? But I said yes, and soon I found out what the task could be. because a few months later, a Muslim invited me to a dialogue meeting between a very famous Danish Muslim Imam, Abdul Wahid Petersen, and me. We were supposed to discuss Islam and Christianity. Do you like to join the meeting? I was asked by the Muslim woman who called me. We will be around 100 Muslims from Copenhagen and Aarhus. And honestly, I didn't like or want to go to this meeting. But I said, oh yes, I really do. I'd like to. Thank you for the invitation. The old Professor P.G. Linhart once said at the end of one of his sermons, it is what you don't want to do that you have to do. He talked about the sense of duty. And I think he's right. So I accepted the invitation, but I was very uncertain. So before the meeting, I invited some Christians from my congregation to join the meeting so that I was not all alone. And they were around 7 or 10 and were sitting on the first row, almost as excited as me. Our dialogue went very well and in good order. And after our discussion, there were questions from the audience. And here, a young Muslim from Copenhagen stood up and said, I have a question for you, Pastor. What can you offer me as a Muslim? And now don't you come up with a cheap answer saying dove or something like that. No. What can you offer me? And what was I to answer him? He asked me as a pastor. That means he wanted to know what the gospel or Christianity could mean for a Muslim. And I was not allowed to say love or God's love, which actually would have been a good answer. But this was for him a cheap answer, so what else could I say and offer to a young, self-confident Muslim who raised up such a simple and fundamental question? Luckily, I had 1 or 2 minutes to reflect because he had other things to say to the audience. But finally, he was silent, and I was supposed to give him an answer. And I answered him as follows. I must say that I only have what you call a cheap answer to give you. I can offer you God's grace. And the word grace comes from the Latin word gratia, which means for free. So this is, of course, a cheap answer. That's what I can offer you. I myself consider this to be a very good answer. It was clear, evident, and true, and the Christians whom I had invited to the meeting agreed. They nodded, almost clapping their hands, because they thought this was a perfectly good answer. But when I looked at the Muslims, then they had quite another reaction. They shook their heads, staring at the floor, and it was obviously that this answer was nonsense for all 100 Muslims. What did I mean? How could I give such an answer? Who was I to offer God's grace to every person in the audience? Did I think I was God? And after the evening went on, and the evening went on with other questions. And after the meeting, I couldn't forget this dialogue and the impression of the Muslims who couldn't or wouldn't understand or accept my answer. Whereas the Christians were quite satisfied with the answer, the Muslims were, I don't know, maybe offended. But what was wrong with my answer? It was obviously not a good answer. So could I have answered him in a better way? Well, I think so. After some days or weeks of reflection, I reached the conclusion that another answer could have been better or at least more challenging. I could have given him this answer instead. I'm sorry to disappoint you because I don't think I have anything to offer you. For me, it seems that you are satisfied and content with Islam, you give the impression that you're rich in your faith. Your hands are full of Islam, therefore I cannot offer you anything. Christianity and the gospel are for the poor, for the hungry, for the thirsty, for the empty-handed, those who have discovered themselves as insufficient and not in the position to do God's will. The gospel is for sinners. This is the persons that the gospel is basically intended for, and for whom Jesus lived and died. And I don't have the impression, I could say to him, that this is how you look at yourself. But listen to me, if you one day will come to the conclusion or realize that you are insufficient and haven't done enough in relation to God or to other people, or you doubt whether God loves you or wants to have anything to do with you, or if you are afraid of the judgment day, on that day you must promise me to come back, because then I have something to offer you. Until then, you must be content or satisfied with Islam. This response would indeed have been more challenging and thought-provoking. If I had given him this answer, he and the audience most likely would have felt both hit and provoked. He might even have been shocked or offended. Every reaction would have been better, much better, than this indifference that I met from the audience. So why was my answer wrong? I offered him the cheap grace. The cheap grace, which is, according to Bonhoeffer, grace without repentance. He calls it justification of sin without justification of the sinner. Cheap grace is the grace we bestow on ourselves. It's not a gift of God. Cheap grace is baptism without church discipline. It's communion without confession. It's grace without the cross. In short, cheap grace, according to Bonhoeffer, is simply grace without Jesus, and grace without Jesus is no grace at all. This is what I learned from this meeting, and which is a topic I deal with in my book. I also want to share another experience with you. Many years ago, we were a group from the church who wanted to make a religious, sociological investigation of the inhabitants in Gellerup. We wanted to know more about their thinking, way of living, faith, and so on. We therefore made an inquiry form and presented it first to a sociologist. Your inquiry form is all right, he said, but you need one more question. That is, how important is God to you? And then you make a scale from 1 to 10 where people can choose a number. Then you can, in a way, take the temperature of people's faith. We agreed and made the inquiry form as he said. But before we went out asking people all these questions, we had a meeting where we tried to interview each other. There were also some Muslims who took part in the interview group, and I was sitting next to a Muslim woman and asked her all the questions. Then I came to the question, how important is God to you? From 1 to 10, which number will you choose? She said 10. Loud and clear and quick. I wrote 10. Then she was the one to ask me. And she came to the question, how important is God to you? Which number will you choose? I was silent. I didn't actually know what to say. After a while, I very silent said, 10. I was thinking, when she was able to say 10, then I can do the same. After all, I'm a pastor. But I had at the same time and afterwards an unpleasant feeling. I felt that I had been lying. And I wondered, what is wrong? The next weeks, I made more than 30 interviews and my experience was loud and clear. The Muslims said 10. Yes, most of them said, God is greater than 10. Find an endless number. God is greater than my life, said even Muslims who had beers and wine on the table and smoked cigarettes. But when I came to the Danish, or the Christians, they were all much more uncertain. They didn't know what to say, most of them said, make it 5, or 5.5 was one of the most precisely answer I got. And after this experience, I thought, why is it so? Is it so that all Muslims are very strong believers and the Christians are tepid or lukewarm? Are Christians and me all weak in our faith? Or what was wrong? My answer is no. I don't think so. Maybe because I had the same feeling. But I think this shows one of the differences between Islam and Christianity. And it says, in my opinion, something very important about Christianity. Jesus was once asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it. The second is the same. It's on the same level. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. That means you are, as a Christian, not allowed valuing God more highly than your neighbor. There must be a balance. God and your neighbor. So if Christians become uncertain and are uncomfortable by saying that God means everything, I find the reason in the Christian faith and in the teaching of Jesus Christ. Never value God more highly than your neighbor. This is a strain which all Christians lives. Your faith never allows you to neglect or suppress human beings in the name of God. God is not greater than my neighbor. In the so-called Sermon on the Mount, Jesus even says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar and first go and be reconciled with your brother. Then come and offer your gift. In the same chapter from Matthew, Jesus says, you have heard that it is said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. How is that possible, you may say? This is the last thing I want to say, and which I also find very important to this topic. How is it possible to fulfill the will of God? And what is actually the will of God? I once had a public meeting in Gellerup with a very well-known pastor and Islamic expert, Colin Chapman. And one of the Muslims asked him, do you in your Christian faith have a similar word or conception as jihad? That means struggle. And the answer was no. We don't have to struggle for the fulfillment of the will of God. We don't have to struggle for the love of God or to please God, because God has already struggled for us. He has given us his love, and the only thing we have to do is to receive his love, like a mirror. The only thing we have to do is to reflect God's love in our daily life. Soon, coming to the end of my lecture, I'll share one more thought-provoking experience which took place many years ago while I was a pastor in Gellerup. I was going to a baptismal visit to talk to a mother who was about to have her child baptized. When I arrived, I noticed that I had been here a few years before, and I also remembered the conversation I had had with the mother, and it hadn't been a very good conversation, because when I encouraged the mother to bring up her child in the Christian faith and say the Lord's Prayer with her child, she said she had just yawned and asked if I wanted to have more coffee. And now she was going to have her second child baptized. So I took the liberty of asking her, how is the baptismal training with your first child going? She smiled and said, I admit that when you were here for the first time and talked about it, I thought that I probably wouldn't do much about bringing up my child in the Christian faith. But I tell you what happened to me for 6 months ago. My girl came from kindergarten and showed me a drawing that she had made there. See a beautiful church that I have painted, she said. But this wasn't a church, it was a mosque. This is a mosque, I said, the mother said. And her girl asked, what's the difference? The Muslim children had painted mosques, and when she did the same, they had told her, yours is a church because you are a Christian, and ours are mosques. And the mother said to me, after this episode, I have decided to read the Bible and pray the Lord's Prayer with my children. I've realized that I have to do something for bringing up my children in the Christian faith, or else they will become Muslims. And I don't want my children to be Muslim. In this way, it can be said that Islam is not only a challenge, but a gift to an old and stiffened or lukewarm Christianity. As my last word, I'll quote an Austrian-British philosopher, Karl Popper. He's very much concerned with tolerance and has the concept he calls the tolerance paradox, which reads, unlimited tolerance leads to intolerance. If tolerance is unlimited, then you can be sure that intolerance will prevail. Therefore, he writes, it is important to set limits for tolerance. And what does this mean for a multicultural and multi-religious society? This means that we must protect the minorities, but we must not let them decide over the majority. Consideration and tolerance goes both ways. I have a definition of tolerance that I'm very happy about. According to the New Danish Dictionary, there are 2 different definitions of tolerance. The first is to be patient or open-minded for those who think differently. The other is tolerance as the maximum allowed distance between 2 machine parts. This is tolerance. In this case, tolerance means a distance, but a maximum allowed distance. Especially this definition I like very much, tolerance as distance. We should not try to pressure or change each other. We must respect the distance, but this must not be too large. If it gets too large, we risk hurting each other. And if it gets too small, it will also affect both of us negatively. So living together with different religions and cultures is not easy. It is a challenge. It might be difficult and painful, but let us remember God's word in the Bible. Love the foreigner. Take care of him or she. And above all, meet them. Talk to them and listen to them. Let's boldly share life and faith with each other, also with the foreigners. We have something to offer to each other. So thank you for your attention.